afterwards for discussion. But if you have a question and you just want to get it out, just type it in the chat if you can, and then we can address it later. Because I know if you're like me, if you don't write it down, you'll forget what you even wanted to say, and then it's gone for good. So. All right, so it is 10 a.m. It is our official start time. And so I'll go ahead and get going. Good morning, everyone. I am so thankful that you chose today to take some time for yourself to get some information. I really hope it is useful for you. So since we do have so many new people signed up today, I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jenny Stang, and I am the Caregiver Outreach Specialist for Alabama Lifespan Respite. And what that means is I go out into the community and I collect all you wonderful souls to come back and spend time with me on the week or during the week for education and trainings that I hope you find helpful and useful in your caregiving journey. We cover many topics, and they're all recorded and put on our website for you to view at any point. So if there's something that maybe you wanted to listen to again, or you didn't catch the first time around, they're always on the website. So I'll enter that email or website address into the chat before we close today so that you can visit and see what trainings we have available to you. So today we're going to talk about setting boundaries as a way to empower yourself as a caregiver. And I know that boundary work, it can be one of those things where we hear a lot about it, and we hear a lot of different ways that we can practice boundaries. But today I'm going to try and take a different spin on the idea of boundaries, not as necessarily something that we do, but as a way that we relate to other people. And so I really hope that this information is useful. So we'll go ahead and get started. So first and foremost, the information I'm presenting to you is the work of Jody McDonald. So I want to give credit where credit's due. I really enjoy Jody's philosophy and her approach to boundaries. I think it's a very compassionate take on boundaries. And she and I share a lot of those same ideas. And so I'm going to try and present her information to you. I'm sure I'm not going to do justice in the way that she does it, but I encourage you to look her up afterwards and get some more of her wonderful information. So Jody, this is taken straight from her website as her bio. She's a dynamic, passionate, and intuitive therapist. Her work centers on uncovering the authentic self, releasing patterns of numbing, pleasing, and armoring in order to soften into our essential humanity and lead a fuller, more satisfying life. She has a BA in Cultural Anthropology and Women's Studies, a Bachelor's of Social Work, and a Master's of Social Work. And she's also certified for integrative body psychotherapy. She's a registered social worker with the British Columbia College of Social Workers. And Jody has been a social worker in the frontline practice since 2000 and a therapist in private practice since 2010. So I'm very grateful that I can glean from her wisdom and her education and share this information with you today. So what is our agenda? Well, we're going to actually talk about boundaries. Big shocker, right? So what are boundaries? And what is a boundary practice? Okay, because boundaries aren't just things that you can just suddenly have. Okay, this is a practice. These are things that it's a skill that we learn. We're going to, struggle in the beginning, surely, but over time, we're going to strengthen that skill set. And so that's why we call it a boundary practice. We're going to talk about why boundaries are important, and especially why they're important in a family caregiving scenario. Then we're going to talk about the types of boundaries. There's 3 different types of boundaries. And we're going to discuss some themes in caregiving families that may make boundary practice a little more challenging. And then I'm going to finish it off with some tips and strategies to help you kind of implement these skills and also just kind of bring everything together. Okay, so bear with me because the beginning of this might seem a little convoluted, but my hope is that by the end of it, you can see exactly where I'm coming from and hopefully be able to apply this to your life. So what are boundaries? So caregivers have a very special relationship with boundaries because by definition, you're in a position for caring for somebody else, right? And so you're almost always going to experience more times when you can't get your needs met because the needs of another person are greater than yours, right? So that's not like regular life. That's one of the big challenges of caregiving. So boundaries for caregivers are a little bit more complicated. And I hope that we can kind of unravel that tangle as we go. So there's three common ways that we use the term boundary, okay? So we can use the word boundary as a communication skill. So like the ability to say no to others. So when someone says, hey, you should really set a boundary with that person, or you're gonna need to set a boundary, what they're usually meaning is that we need to say, no, that's enough, we can't do that, right? We need to say no, it's shorthand for saying no. And so if you relate to the idea of sometimes having trouble saying no or setting limits, that's not a communication skill. Most of us, or a communication skill problem, excuse me, because most of us have the ability to find the words that we need to say, right? We can say no. And sometimes we talk about boundary in terms of physical space, right? So we can tell when someone is in our physical space or like in our personal bubble. We can get a strong body message about that, right? So for example, have you ever been at like an ATM machine or, at a bank, at the desk or whatever, and someone's too close, like a stranger is too close to you? And you're uncomfortable with that because your body is telling you, right? This person's in my personal space. This person's in my boundary. Okay. So we probably take action and step away, right? So the way that I'll talk about boundaries is very similar in that we will get cues from our inner self, from our body, from our emotions that tell us when people are in our emotional or in our mental space. Okay. And sometimes we hear the word boundary in terms of the rules under which like you would contact like a professional, right? So like you wouldn't call your doctor at home, even if you had their phone number. So those are some common ways that we think about boundaries. So I'd like to reframe this idea of setting boundaries as the way that we relate to other people and the role that we take in relationships. So the boundaries I'm going to talk about today are not really about saying no, they're about saying no and yes to others and to ourselves, okay? So what is a boundary practice? So sometimes we have patterns of relating to other people from before you started your role as a caregiver, and that can make caregiving a little bit more challenging. So boundaries are about an inner sense of self. So how do I know what's me and what is someone else? Okay, that's essentially what boundary practice is. So we know that from the sensations or feelings or perceptions that come to us from the inside, from our inner experience. So for most of us, especially in a caring role, when we get with somebody whose needs are greater than ours, we lose that sense of connection to our inner self. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand exactly what I'm saying. So when we care for another person, think of it like this. I'm tuning into you, right? And I'm seeing what you need. And I'm going to send my energy, or I'm going to take action out to give you what you need, right? And what I'm talking about in boundary practice is also about being able to tune into ourselves and to be able to notice what we need, right? So in that sense, a healthy boundary would look like I can see you and I can see me. I can hear what you need and I can hear what I need. Okay, and it's going back and forth between those two things. It's like the feeling, that sense of connection to another person while also feeling connected to ourselves. And what happens a lot in caregiving is we do a lot of giving outwardly, right? But we forget about that part where we give to ourselves. And that's what makes it very difficult to take care of ourselves, okay? So to set boundaries, we need to be able to identify our own experience and differentiate it from another person's experience. So if someone else is frustrated or sad and we feel something in relationship or in relation to what they're feeling, that's what we call empathy, right? We feel with another person. We're feeling along with another person. So in a boundary practice, it means that we're able to see that what we're feeling is actually our own feeling. And we're not feeling the other person's feeling. We're feeling our own feeling about their feeling. Does that make sense? So when someone else is sad, we might feel sad, but we're really just recalling our own experiences of sadness. So in boundary practice, it's really important to be able to differentiate what is someone else's feeling and what is our feeling, okay? Again, it's that this is you and this is me, okay? So think of boundaries as like a container that we create for our own energy, right? Our own essence, our own selfhood. And you can think about it like this. What happens to your sense of self if it has no container? If we have no ability to tune into ourselves and notice what we're feeling, what does that look like? Especially when we might be overwhelmed, and especially when things that we're dealing with on a daily basis are very challenging and sometimes too hard for us, right? And I'm sure as caregivers, you're kind of getting what I'm saying, right? That we lose a sense of who we are when we are constantly meeting the needs of another person. So why are boundaries important? So when we care for others without boundaries, we experience more resentment, frustration, fatigue, and burnout because there's no separation between how the other person feels and how we feel. So without boundaries, we're more vulnerable to compassion fatigue. And if you think about those words, what does it mean? It means you're literally tired of caring. And I think any of us who've been caregivers have come to a place where we experience that feeling of being tired of caring. And that's very difficult for us to experience. And we can feel guilty about that a lot of times. And so boundary practice will help us to notice that we're getting tired of caring. Okay, so again, it's just another way that we're tuning into ourselves. So another thing that we run a victim of is vicarious traumatization. So that's kind of a big word. It comes from social work and other helping professions. And the textbook definition is the emotional residue of exposure to traumatic stories and experiences of others, witnessing fear, pain, and terror that others have experienced. Okay, so that's vicarious traumatization. And as caregivers, you're always around somebody, or potentially you're around somebody who's always kind of in a state of pain or suffering. Okay, and that affects us, especially if you're a caring person, right? Especially if you're empathetic, you're going to take all that pain and suffering onto yourself. Okay. So this can happen when you're caring for someone who's going through something very difficult and you're witnessing what they're experiencing. It's not happening to you, but it has an effect on you to see someone else suffering. So these are the kinds of stressors that caregiving brings, right? It's not something that's your fault, or it's not a sign that you're caregiving wrong. These are just organic hazards of caregiving that are part of almost everyone's experience, okay? So when we care without boundaries, we have less energy for our own lives, our own goals, and our own interests, because there's not enough of ourselves in our own life. Amen, right? So when you're a caregiver, it's very hard to take time for yourself. It's very hard in the face of what the person that you're caring for is dealing with to see your own needs as important, right? So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. So boundaries are also important because they give us an awareness of our inside experience, and that can help us to take better care of ourselves and to stay in balance so that boundaries can make our caregiving sustainable, right? That's the goal, because a lot of you have been caregiving for years and years and years and years, right? And having that sustainability can be very difficult. So it's essentially, the caregiving role is essentially, we use our intelligence, our empathy, and our relationship to know what the other person needs and how to care for them. And so what I'm suggesting is it's important to remember to sometimes also check in with ourselves to see how we're doing. So that means just take a breath into your body and notice how we're experiencing that moment, that day, and to name it for ourselves, and then come back into our caregiving role. So an example would be, I can only relate as a mother, okay, because that's what my caregiving journey has looked like. Have you ever been in a situation where, your loved one that you're caring for, their needs are very intense that day, right? They need, any myriad of number of things, right? And you're overwhelmed and you're frustrated, okay? Boundary practice is really just about taking a breath, acknowledging, yes, I'm frustrated. Yes, I'm tired, okay? And then doing what you need to do, go back into your caregiving role, but making a note, right? Validating that feeling within yourself, feeling yourself in that situation, right? So you're kind of setting that boundary practice up, like, this is me and that is you, okay? I can feel overwhelmed and I can meet your needs, but I'm not going to do it at the expense of acknowledging how I feel in this moment. Okay, so it's kind of like putting a pin in how you feel so that you can take care of it later. Okay, it's not ignoring it, it's not blowing up. Okay, it's just being aware, attuning into yourself. So boundaries are especially important in family caregiving because as a caregiver, you're deliberately placing yourself in a position of service. And that means your goal is to give to another person, to identify their needs and to help them. That's what the role is. And when the needs of the other person that we're caring for consistently exceed our own needs, it makes it seem very logical to deny those needs. right? So if you think about any given day in your caregiving role, the needs of the person you're caring for might be high relative to your own needs. And those are the conditions that lead you to think, oh, well, I don't need to go for that walk, or I don't need to go to the bathroom if I need to, or I don't need to eat my lunch, right? We put our own needs off, and sometimes that's necessary. But the problem with this is that you can be a wonderful, excellent caregiver and do everything right, right? You can have a day where you don't get frustrated, where you get a lot done, you can just knock it out of the park and you're really productive. And maybe it's your best day of caregiving, but then you wake up the next morning and the needs of the person will be just as high. So even your best offering doesn't really change the situation very much. And so it's not sustainable to not meet our own needs, at least some of the time, even if our needs seem to be not as great as the person we're caring for, okay? So if you think about that, if you're always putting yourself off, if you're always not, choosing to not take that walk or do that self-care, how long is that going to be sustainable for you? Especially if you're looking at years and years and years of caregiving. It's just not, okay? So we know that for most of us, giving feels good, right? And most of us are consenting to be caregivers and we wish to take care of this person that we love, but we're giving more than we're able to, or more than we wish to on any given day, day in and day out. That's stressful, and it creates resentment and guilt. And so it makes it really hard to keep giving. It's the place where we start to feel like the role of caregiving is eroding our sense of self and our sense of well-being. How many of y'all been there? So caregiving is based on our ability to continue to meet another person's need over time, even when those needs are demanding and sometimes exceeding our capacity. So boundaries are important because they make caregiving sustainable. So obviously, we don't always feel like we have permission to say no or to set limits. And what happens when you might have like respite available to you, but you feel guilty about having your loved one go to respite so that you can get a little break, especially if it feels like they're not consenting to go, right? So respite is also about sustainability of caregiving. And your guilt is easier to deal with when you have a framework for your sense of self, okay? And we'll get into that a little bit more. And later we're going to talk a little bit about how self-compassion is a really wonderful companion to boundary work. But for now, I think I'm going to talk a little bit about guilt, because guilt is something that I think caregivers experience a lot more than we'd like to admit. But it's a very, very poor motivator. So whenever we do something out of guilt to avoid this feeling of I'm bad and I've done something wrong, we're creating a future situation of resentment. So guilt and resentment are the rock and the hard place of caregiving, right? If we're acting from a place of guilt, we're going to lead ourselves into resentment. When we feel resentful, we might get angry and we might act out. And we don't always have those feelings towards the person that we're caring for, right? Sometimes we have those feelings towards other family members or towards the healthcare system or whoever just is in our path at the time. But we get to that peak of resentment and then we'll go back over to a sense of guilt, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about how to offset that through the practice of boundary. So it's an essential skill of being in service to others to learn how to be a good steward of your own energy. Okay. So caregiving is one of the roles that we may have in life where it's especially challenging to be good stewards of our own energy, because our own energy or a sense of ourself is challenged by the role of caregiving. But we can always learn, and we can learn to be better stewards of our own energy. And sometimes what's making our caregiving role more difficult are sometimes the patterns of relating that we had even before we were a caregiver. So this is true especially in family caregiving, when the person we're caring for is our spouse or a parent or a partner, where there's a long established pre-existing role or pattern of relating, and that might make the way that we care a little more difficult. And I'll explain that a little bit more here too. So we're going to talk about the different types of boundaries. We have vague, rigid, and healthy, flexible boundaries. So these are actually just ways of relating, patterns of relating, or ways of doing boundary. So the graphic I have up here is like the 3 stages of matter, because this is how it makes sense to me, okay? A vague boundary is going to be like steam. Very permeable, very, anything can get in, right? Anything can get mixed up in that. A rigid boundary is going to be more like the ice, right? Very solid, hard to get through. Nothing's getting past that. It's there, right? And then we have healthy, flexible, which is more like water, okay? Where it flows, it's in its own self, but it can fit containers as needed, right? So we're going to look for more of that boundary pattern. There we go. So we're going to focus most of our time on patterns of vague boundaries because it's the thing that makes us much more prone to giving all of our energy away and not keeping any for ourselves. Having vague boundaries makes us feel like even the idea of separating our feelings from someone else or taking some space to ourselves will make us feel guilty. Okay, that's a vague boundary pattern. And we can feel selfish if we try to set those boundaries. So in a pattern of vague boundaries, I want to suggest that we have very little accuracy for seeing what is actually selfish, right? Because we're not usually very selfish at all. In fact, you're probably a very selfless person, and it makes it very hard to take time and space for yourselves without feeling guilty, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about, or most of the talk is going to be on the vague boundaries. So again, most of the structure of boundary or the ways of relating, we learned very early in our lives, usually from our first families. So we all have a dominant pattern of relating. And so for those of us who identify with having a lot of empathy or being a caregiver, for most of our lives, even before we were official caregiver with a capital C, right? It's just part of who you are. And you might notice that you have a pattern of vague boundaries. So in this pattern, our sense of connection to other people is so important to us. It's such an important place of emotional safety that we can forego our connection to ourselves. Okay, and you're going to see that boundaries, the way we relate to people, is really about how are we feeling safe in our own bodies. Okay, so it's the idea that we're really focused in this direction, right? Looking at the care recipient, we're really focused on what other people need and their desires. We're putting them first. And it's so important that we're going to forego who we are, right? So it's a good way to be, you know, to think of others before we think of ourselves, except in this pattern, we do that even when it harms us to do so, okay? Giving can be very harmful to you. And you don't even notice that it's happening to you until it's too late, right? How many times have you gotten to a point where I'm fine, until you're not, right? That happens a lot. So what's happening here is you don't know yourself in the style of relating, right? We don't know ourselves that well. We don't know our preferences, our needs, and our feelings because we tend to be really focused on the connection that we can make with other people by connecting to what they need. So sometimes maybe we do get a day to ourselves or some time off and we get the opportunity to tune into ourselves. And sometimes we don't even know what we'd want to do that day. Has that happened to any of you guys? You don't even know what would be restorative, right? So the connection that we have with another person is so important that we're not going to jeopardize it. Okay, so we're putting their needs before ours as a way of feeling safe in that relationship. Okay. So in this style of relating, we have trouble saying no and setting limits. We act on behalf of others and not on our own behalf. So we act as though the needs of others are more important than our own needs. And that will make us less aware of our needs over time, right? If you're constantly ignoring them, how are you even going to know what they are? So think about it like this: the volume knob on your inner voice, the thing that tells you I'd rather do this instead of that, it's turned way down. And sometimes it can be even muted. And so if we do get time to tune into ourselves, we don't even see the value of that. And in this pattern of relating, we often have trouble seeing or respecting other people's boundaries as well, but in a nice way, right? In a caregiving way, in a kind way. And it can be somewhat unbounded in our care for other people because our priority is on connection. Okay, so I can relate to this as a mother, right? So if you've ever had children and taking care of their needs as they grow, that's part of the job, right? But as my children get older, I see that, you know, if they have a need, I'm instantly going in for it, right? Instantly trying to solve that problem for them. And what I'm doing is I'm hindering them from being able to discover their own strengths. Right. And so sometimes I can get kind of antsy, you know, when I have the solution, I can fix this, I can help, right? I can get my hands in it. And so I have to kind of like respect my boundaries at that point and say, okay, this is them, this is me. Let them see what they can do first. And if I need to assist, I will. So that can kind of, maybe you can relate to that a little bit where even outside of caregiving, if there's a need presented to you in your relationships, you just have that personality to be like, let me help, right? That's not bad, but if you're constantly doing that and never checking in with yourself, it's not going to be sustainable, and you're going to end up losing sense of what your needs are. Okay. So in vague boundaries, we're also afraid of losing connection to others or disappointing them if we tell them the truth about our feelings, or if we take up space to meet our own needs. So in caregiving, we can see this pattern of relating when where we are the person who tunes into others and gives them what they need, just generally in the family, right? And so when the needs of the person that we're caring for necessitate that we become the primary caregiver, that often means that we can't do it as much as we did before for other people. We can't provide or be as connected to other people, and it's really hard for us to tell the truth about our feelings and take up space to meet our own needs. So in this pattern of relating, when we notice someone else's needs, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to try and meet that need. And you can feel very anxious if you're aware that someone else's needs and you're not able to take steps to meet that. So again, the style of relating is all about connecting with other people. Okay. So the style of boundary practice also inevitably produces feelings of anger or even rage. And it's hard for us to picture that, but if you've ever found yourself saying to anyone, well, I've done this and this and this and this for you, and you can't even do this one thing for me, right? That's what I mean by that rage. You might not be hulking out, right? But you're feeling like an offense, right? You're feeling something, you're being angry about the constant give and that lack of reciprocity. Okay, so it's when we've been so other focused and not tuning into ourselves, not taking care of ourselves, and we kind of expect that it's going to come back around and someone's going to take care of us, but then they don't, right? So then all of a sudden we're noticing all the ways that we've been taking care of other people, and we feel angry and justified, right? In that anger. And those feelings are really important, and they're an authentic response to a pattern, which is essentially self-abandonment. Okay. So we can take that anger out on other people, but really it's ourselves who hasn't been looking after ourselves. Okay. We haven't been meeting our own needs. We're expecting it to kind of loop around where someone's going to take care of us. So it's really hard for us when we're all about connecting to someone else, but then we hit that limit of how much we can abandon ourselves. And so noticing when we've reached our limit is actually a good thing, but then, we might get angry. And we might lash out at someone who's not even in that dynamic, right? You ever just lose your cool on somebody who had, wasn't even doing anything really that big of a deal, but they were the landing spot for all those emotions that you were feeling. Okay. But then of course you're going to feel guilty again and usually come right back out with that desire to connect to other people. So it's not actually others who have failed to meet our needs most of the time. Again, it's that mute button or the fact that we haven't really been attuning to ourselves or creating enough space for ourselves in our own lives, okay, where you reach that breaking point. So now we're going to talk about rigid boundaries. So many people have this pattern of rigid boundaries, but sometimes those of us who have more of a vague boundary style, we swing over to rigid boundaries when we get to that place of anger or frustration or rage. Okay, so again, you're seeing these boundary styles. You can kind of dip your toes into all of them sometimes. Okay, so you have a dominant pattern of relating. And then you can kind of get some of these other boundaries sprinkled in. Okay, so you can get to rigid boundaries when you've hit that wall of anger or frustration or resentment. And this might be a place where we come to temporarily, but we don't usually last too long here. In a pattern of rigid boundaries, we feel a strong need to protect ourselves, and we can be very defensive from this place. We feel separate from others, and that feels safe to us. Okay. So this kind of boundary is really more like a wall. And it's kind of like saying, I can maintain this sense of connection to myself if I keep other people at a distance. I've been there before, right? Sometimes when we've been all in our vague boundary pattern and giving all of our energy away, it almost feels like a relief to come to this state of rigid boundary, right? And we fear that in this state, we're going to lose our sense of connection to ourselves if we connect with someone else. And this is a state which we don't want to talk about it. We don't want anyone to help us. And we kind of just want people to leave us alone, right? That's a rigid boundary. So I said before with vague boundaries, my connection with you is important to me, and I don't need connection with myself. I'm willing to forego my connection to myself. And in rigid boundaries, it's the idea that I'm connected to myself, so I can hear my inner voice, the volume's turned way up. But if I connect with you, I'm going to lose that sense of myself. Okay. So In a rigid boundary, you're going to say no frequently, and you can sometimes be very grumpy about it and maybe even say it more forcefully than you mean to. And we often choose rigid boundaries after having vague boundaries and getting hurt or exhausted. And then the pendulum kind of swings back and forth, right? So you see how these two are connected. A lot of the time, if we're giving too much in our connection to other people, then this is where we have to take our energy back. So in a healthy boundary, each person comes about halfway, right? 50-50. But in caregiving, we know that the person we're caring for cannot be fully present for us or be in this kind of pattern of relating. So sometimes they may be at 20%, and in order to connect with them and to provide for them, we'll go to 80 in order to make sure that we can make that connection, right? And stay connected. But the problem with this is that if we continually go to 80, right, in this way, it also means at some point we're going to have to go back to 20 just for self-preservation. Okay, so it's really tough for us because we're either giving all of our care and all of our energy away, or we are in rigid boundary, and we can sometimes feel grumpy and frustrated and resentful, right? And we don't want any kind of connection. So I'm suggesting that a healthy boundary pattern means that we can stay at 50% a lot more. And of course, you have to meet that person where they are and go to 80% when you need to, but then come back to 50%, okay? So you can say, I know I'm gonna have to do more than I want to right now, but when I can, I'm gonna come back to this place of not overgiving, okay? You can't stay giving 80 all the time, okay? So this will allow us to stay more present because I know it's very difficult for us and sometimes exhausting to go back and forth in that wide range, right? And it can be very confusing for the people that are in our lives, right? Oh, she's so open, she's so giving, she's so caring, until she's not, right? So we want to try and keep that sustainable, even keel, and boundary practice helps us do that. Okay. So here's a little graph or little visual aid. There we go. We've got this this spectrum here, right? On one side is bond, on the other side is breathing room. And when we're not getting enough bond, we're prone to feelings of abandonment, okay? Or we're seeking that bond to prevent that feeling of abandonment, okay? And with breathing room, if it's too rigid, where we only have breathing room, okay, this usually comes out of a feeling of inundation. And that word inundation means to be overwhelmed or flooded, okay? So what this means, this continuum here means that everybody needs bond and everybody needs breathing room. So these are basic human needs that we all have. So when we don't get enough bond, whether as a pattern in our lives, we don't feel enough connection, or just on any given day or conversation, it gives rise to that feelings of abandonment. And those feelings are kind of anxious, right? So we feel like the safety would be reestablished through more connection. So we have that feeling of longing or wanting to be in connection with others. But we focus a lot on bond, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but we also need breathing room as a fundamental need. And when we don't get enough breathing room, it gives rise to that feeling of inundation, okay, that overwhelming, that flooding. So in a state of inundation, we fear losing our sense of self or being consumed or overwhelmed in this state. Okay, so that means that space would feel safe to us. Okay, so I believe that caregiving is inherently inundating, right? There's just no other way to say it. It's gonna be overwhelming to you. It's overwhelming because our role as a caregiver is to essentially to provide bond for another person, right? We don't get enough breathing room in these roles, and it's really hard to get breathing room. So again, let's talk about guilt. A lot of us come into a role of caregiving already with a pattern of vague boundaries where it's our role to comfort, to be making connection through caring for other people. And when it becomes our main role to care for another person whose needs are going to exceed our own, it's very difficult to be the person whose role it is to provide bond. So healthy boundaries are, I'm fully present and you're fully present. But we know in caregiving, especially if you're caregiving for someone who has like dementia, that's not always the case, right? So we might be providing bond, but it doesn't mean that we're receiving bond from that person that we're caring for. So this is another reason why it's so important to have that self-attunement, right? To check in with yourself, to see and hear ourselves and what we're doing. So breathing room is also something that we can provide for ourselves just by noticing how overwhelmed we are or how inundated we are. So by taking a breath naming the ways that we feel and telling ourselves the truth about how we feel, and offering ourselves some self-compassion. Okay. Self-compassion practice is particularly good and helpful for caregivers, especially if you kind of get into this pattern of thinking of, I should have done this, I shouldn't have done that, I could have done better, right? You're always critiquing yourself, probably a lot more harshly than anybody else is critiquing yourself. So self-compassion practice is a really, really helpful tool for caregivers. So here's just a quick synopsis of what this means in 3 ways. So self-compassion practice means to first notice that you're suffering. And that first one is tough for a lot of us, especially those of us who just put on our armor and kind of push through things because we know that they're too hard, right? And noticing that you're suffering can be as simple as saying like, ow, right? Or, oh, this is hard. And just noticing that something is hard for you. That's self-compassion, okay? So the second step is to meet your suffering with kindness. So we can simplify this by saying the first step is ow, and the second one is awe. Right? So instead of saying, come on, get it together, just get back in there, right? It's to say yourself, this is hard, right? And to be kind to yourself in the face of your own suffering, okay? And I think sometimes we think this shouldn't be something that I have a hard time with, right? I love this person. I want them to be as healthy and happy as they can be, right? But when you deny the reality that you're experiencing, that this is hard, we're not giving ourselves the compassion that we need, okay? So the third thing that is so important, especially in caregiving, is this idea of locating your experience or your moment of suffering in common humanity. And so what that means is that anybody who's in a family role, caregiving for someone else, is going to feel overwhelmed sometimes. You're going to feel like running away. It's going to feel incredibly overwhelming and inundating, and you're going to feel angry sometimes, and you're going to be frustrated sometimes. Anybody is going to feel that way. And I think that this practice is really helpful to kind of offset a lot of that guilt that we feel, because there's no way to do this kind of work without sometimes feeling guilty. It's just part of it. So meeting yourself in those feelings of guilt with compassion, okay? You're not wrong for feeling overwhelmed. That's a common experience of a lot of people who are doing this job, okay? So it's not that there's something wrong with you, and just acknowledging you feel this way, validating it, and giving yourself that compassion. That's an additional component to boundary practice, right? Because you have to be able to see yourself in this. Otherwise, you can't create boundaries. So healthy and flexible boundaries. So in a healthy, flexible boundary, we can connect to someone else and stay connected to ourselves at the same time. So that's the difference. I can be connected to you, and I can also be connected to myself. We can see and hear ourselves, so we know what we need, what we feel most of the time, and that's what we call self-attunement, okay? And we can also separate our feelings from other people's feelings while still feeling empathy, okay? So again, empathy is feeling with somebody, not taking their feelings on as our own, okay? So this helps us when the person that we're caring for or other people are not particularly happy with us, or they're not receiving the care in the way that we're offering it, okay? The idea that something is happening outside of our boundary that causes some feelings inside our boundary, but those two things are separate, okay? So let's discuss some themes in caregiving families, which are very common and very complicated and difficult sometimes, but they can be met with boundary practice. So I've already mentioned the first one, which is sometimes the primary caregiver has a pattern of vague boundaries with the care recipient from before the caregiving began, right? So this is already an established pattern in your relationship. And I'm just going to be very frank with you. If you recognize yourself in a pattern of vague boundaries, that's the pattern that you came in with, you're going to get creamed as a caregiver, okay? Because there's no limit. There's no limit to your sense of energy and your sense of what you need to give to the other person, right? You're just going to be, hemorrhaging yourself out into another person. So of course, I'm not suggesting in any way that you have to stop doing this part, right? It's just about adding a bit more of boundary practice. So it's a simple, subtle inner shift, but it brings you into your own life more so that you can take better care of yourself. So when as caregivers, we're already having vague boundaries, and then we get into a caregiving role where all of a sudden the needs are very high, this vague boundary pattern is going to be very hard for us to maintain. Okay, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, right? You guys know what I'm talking about. The second theme that I think is important is that the care receiver may have more rigid boundaries or experience higher inundation, that feeling of overwhelm or flooded. And we can feel that inundation feeling sometimes even in response to someone else's good intentions. So when our loved one has more of a pattern of rigid boundaries, they don't want to connect. They would rather connect with themselves, and they can be grumpy and a little rigid around that, right? And that makes the experience of being cared for more difficult, and it makes the experience of the caregiver more difficult. This is a very common pattern, even in relationships where someone who needs more breathing room is in a relationship with someone who needs more bond, and then they just kind of go back and forth, right? But then, of course, when you add caregiving on top of it, that back and forth isn't as frequent, okay? So caregiving by definition is a little inundating for the person being cared for, right? I'm sure a lot of them have lost a lot of independence themselves, right? And so that can make them feel very overwhelmed, okay? So sometimes the person being cared for can have a high need for bond, and that can feel quite inundating for the caregiver. But the reverse can also be true, that the caregiver can be very comfortable giving lots of bond, but the care receiver feels inundated by that. And it's a very challenging dynamic because it also makes it hard for the caregiver to feel like what they're doing is valuable and welcome, okay? So again, you're kind of seeing this interplay between bond and breathing room, okay? So some other themes in caregiving families is when an adult sibling or an adult child is the caregiver for a parent. And of course, this can also be true if it's a spouse caregiver, but there might be this dynamic that takes place when geographically, maybe one of the adult children lives closer to their parents than the other sibling, and then conflict arises within the siblings, right? So this is not actually because of the caregiving itself, but it's due to the underlying pattern of relating. This means that we connect with other people by providing bond. When we perceive that our sibling is providing bond for our parent more than we can feel outside of that bond, okay? So a lot of the time, the other siblings can be critical of the caregiving sibling or the sibling who's closer to the family dynamic, and it can feel like they're nitpicking. So what's happening there is they're feeling insecure about being outside of that bond. So this is a way to notice through pattern of relating. And a lot of the time, the sibling caregiver can feel very criticized or picked on, or again, inundated by the other sibling because there's this perception that they're in a more bonded relationship. So if you've got, if you have a sibling who's also kind of a giver and they're not able to give the way that they want to because they don't live around, mom or dad or what have you, then they're going to try to interject themselves into that bond by kind of like backseat driving, like backseat caregiving. It's because they're craving that bond as well. Okay. So another time is when the caregiver is a spouse and adult children might not clearly see the relationship dynamics in the parents' marriage. So this is partially because their own relationship with their parents, the bond and the breathing room that they provide for their parents kind of dominates their experience, right? So they have an idea of what relating to that parent is like, right? Because everyone in their family has their own narrative. And a lot of times there's these dynamics in the marriage that the adult children don't know about. And so not everyone's telling the same story about that, and it can make it a lot more challenging. And so another theme is that if the primary caregiver is a spouse, they may have less bond to offer their adult children, right? And so that's where it can get a little tricky. Or other family or close friends, because that's what they're offering so much every day to the care receiver. So this can cause conflicts and kind of shake things up in the family because our role has been to provide bond, and then you're no longer able to provide that role. So perhaps some of you who are taking care of a spouse and you have adult children and you are not in a situation where you can provide that bond, where you can meet them 50-50, right? Or 80-20, whatever it is your child's needs. The child might start to feel resentful, right? May not even be aware of that resentment, but think, wow, I used to spend more time with mom and now she just seems very flippant or, doesn't seem very interested, okay? What they're not understanding is that your capacity to provide bond is now having to shift more so to the spouse or to whomever you're caring for. So that means inevitably it's going to have to be reduced from other relationships, okay? And that can cause a very unhappy child. But again, boundary practice is about what is my responsibility and what is theirs, okay? Separating yourself from how somebody feels. So here's some tips and strategies to kind of help you establish a boundary practice. So there's 5 general ideas that may be helpful in your caregiving. The first one is simple, to just check your boundary. Okay, have a sense of your boundary or that self-attunement throughout the day. Okay, this doesn't mean withdrawing your attention from others, but just adding the idea of paying attention to yourself, checking in. How do I feel about this? Just a little check-in, take a deep breath, maybe picture having a boundary around yourself and remind yourself that it's okay to have that boundary. It's okay to have separate feelings from the person that you're caring for. It's very hard to meet your own needs when you don't know what they are, right? So even though we know that we cannot always get our needs met most of the time when we're caregiving, it's really important to know what they are for those times when we can meet our needs, right? So if you think about it this way, if you're having one of those moments where you're feeling overwhelmed and inundated, okay, but the show must go on, right? You still have to change those sheets. You still have to make that meal. You still have to run to that doctor's appointment, right? Checking in with yourself in those times, saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling tired. I need to make a mental note that when I get the chance to fill my cup, I'm going to do it. Okay. And whatever that looks like for you. Okay. The second one is to offer yourself breathing room. Okay, so it's kind of playing off all that. Again, breathing room is that element that we don't get much of in caregiving. And sometimes we're not getting enough bond either, but a lot of the time it's the dynamic of where caregiving is very inundating for us. It's the breathing room that we need. So with self-compassion, we notice our need for breathing room as well as bond. That might look like silence, right? Or something that doesn't help anybody else and it's not interesting to anybody else. For me, my breathing room is sitting outside and just feeling the sun on my face. Okay, that's not benefiting anybody but me. And that's how I get my breathing room. Okay, so notice the thoughts or feelings that arise for you when you feel the need for space. Again, checking in with yourself. A lot of the time, that's where our guilt lies, is when we have that need for space. And so I really want to normalize that breathing room is fundamental. Okay, it's as fundamental as bond. We need both. We need breathing room as much as we need bond. And in fact, sometimes when our bond need is met, that's when the need for breathing room arises. So you can gently coach yourself into normalizing the need for breathing room as well as bond, and then begin to connect times of irritation and anger or frustration or despair to the absence of breathing room. Okay, so instead of heaping those hot coals on your head and feeling bad for needing breathing room, please know that it's essential for all human beings, regardless of the situation we're in. We have to have that breathing room space. So by checking in, having that self-compassion, right, you can look back and think, oh, I haven't had any space. And that's now why I'm in this pattern of rigid boundaries, right, where you just want everybody to go away. You want everybody to be quiet, right? So just trying to carve out any time by sometimes being grumpy and irritable with other people because we haven't had any breathing room at all. And you can meet yourself in the feelings of irritation and anger and frustration through more self-compassion, right? Nobody can do caregiving without some guilt and resentment. So the idea is not to avoid guilt and resentment. It's the ability to name what they are and have a way to respond to them, right? Just be like, oh, I see you, guilt, right? I see you there. So the invitation to feel guilty and invitations to feel resentful, they will always come. Right. And that's not a sign that you're doing caregiving wrong. That's just what caregiving is. It's very inundating and complicated relationally. Okay. So again, that grace, that self-compassion, you're not horrible for feeling like you need space. Okay. It's a human, basic human need. Okay. So the third thing to notice and name is that overwhelm, that inundation. So notice when you feel inundated by the needs of others and flooded, overwhelmed, right? It's too much, that feeling of like urgently needing space, because it cannot be anyone's job to provide bond for everyone at all times. Okay. We must understand that the state of inundation is trying to tell us something about the imbalance in our lives. So notice when it's our role in relationship to be the provider of bond, and then practice bringing your energy or your presence back again to halfway. So when we're going all in all the time, far over our boundary to 80%, we're going to have to shift back and go to 20%, right? That's that state of swinging back and forth from inundation or rigid boundaries. So if we practice instead of going, full to 80 as our default move, we just try to stay at 50% in this neutral space, a boundary space. right? And that'll help us to offset being so overgiving and feeling so overwhelmed. And so the fourth thing, which is sometimes very helpful, is just to make our boundary visible. Okay, so that could be just practice imagining yourself in a boundary, or also seeing other people in their boundaries. And it can actually be a relief to remember that other people also have boundaries, and you don't always have to be in there either, right? So you may find it helpful to draw a circle on a piece of paper, and inside that circle you can write what you're responsible for, right? What is in your boundary. So that could be how you feel, whether you get enough sleep, what your reaction to things are that happen, your sense of life satisfaction, feeling of doing a good job, right? Those are things that are inside your boundary. And of course, they might be different for everybody, for you, but those are just some examples. And then outside of the circle, write what you're not responsible for, right? I'm not responsible for what my daughter thinks about me. I'm not responsible for my spouse's level of life satisfaction. There are things that are truly not our responsibility. And when we're engaging with, we're going to be invited to be responsible, but those things are outside of our circle. So we don't have to accept that invitation. So if you picture having a circle around you and someone outside your boundary is angry and they're upset, and that can produce a feeling of discomfort or unsafety. And a lot of time we think, if I can get this person to stop being mad, then I don't have to feel these feelings, right? But when we're trying to change what's outside of our boundary, a lot of times we're working too hard because we really can't do that, right? So the image I have for that is like being on a hamster wheel, right? You're going to have to be doing that forever. And what we can do with our self-attunement is to say, okay, I need to meet myself in this feeling. Like, it's very hard for me when this person is angry. And so maybe once our own feelings then, kind of subside, we might need to communicate with that person about the impact of their behavior, right? And having that conversation does not mean that we take ownership of their response or their feelings or their behavior, okay? So their behavior is not in our boundary and we're not responsible for it. So another good metaphor is the idea of like just doing a little scan, right, of your boundary. Be like, well, hey, how did that get in there, right? Like just like a weed, you pick it up and just toss it out, right? Put it back outside the boundary, right? There's something in here that's not mine, and I'm going to bring it back outside. Okay, that's how we take better care of ourselves. So the last piece is back to that theme of guilt, which is really such a big one, neutralizing guilt. So I don't think that we can avoid guilt, right? It's part of the dynamics of caregiving, but we can take it down a notch. We can neutralize it. So again, guilt is a very poor motivator because it leads us to having more vague boundaries. So guilt is often the motivator of doing more than we wish to, even if we get a no from our inside experience. So even if our inner sense of self is saying no, and we say yes to avoid that feeling of I did something wrong or I'm a bad person, okay, that's not sustainable. So we can meet feelings of guilt with this phrase, I'm not bad and I haven't done anything wrong. So this is a very powerful phrase to say to yourself when you start to feel guilty. I am not bad and I haven't done anything wrong. So just because someone else is upset with us, someone else is angry, or someone else is asking us to do something, if we don't want to do that thing, we're not bad and we haven't done anything wrong. It's not your job to continually prove over and over again that you're a good person. You're already a good person, right? So know that others can have a different opinion outside of your boundary, and invitations to feel guilty, they'll always come. And you can decline them. In fact, I'm going to suggest that you must decline some of them if you're going to make your caregiving sustainable. So remember that when we feel guilty, we feel less, or when we feel less guilty, we feel less resentment too. So if you can neutralize even some of the feelings of guilt that you have by meeting them in this way, I'm not bad, I haven't done anything wrong, then we'll feel less resentment as well. Because when we do things to avoid feeling guilty, we're contributing to that future resentment, right? So we have the right to feel good about ourselves, even when we don't do anything right, okay? This is such an important theme in caregiving. So what does it mean or look like to be doing caregiving right? A lot of us feel like we're doing caregiving wrong because of any of the dynamics or the feedback that we might get on any given day, sometimes even from the person who's receiving the care. But we have the right to feel like a good person and like we have a boundary and a separate sense of self, even when other people don't feel like we're doing everything right. So it's a very hard thing to do, and there's no perfection in caregiving. So that's the information I have for you today, and I would like to open it up for any comments or questions. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I'm also gonna stop the recording.